remembers the shape of your foot, and the soft mud arranges itself around you with a patient sigh. The open sky is a dimming blue, turning lavender, then deeper blue again, as if the world were breathing in time with the slow arrival of night. You can taste a hint of salt at the back of your tongue. You can hear a distant gull calling once and then folding into silence. Between the shore and the sea is this broad, gleaming expanse, as calm as a page waiting for ink, patterned with shallow channels and ridges that look like the tide's handwriting. The gullies meander, and the ripples hold pooled water that reflects the sky so perfectly you almost forget which way is up. As you walk, place each step gently and imagine each footfall as an invitation to the tiny lives beneath the surface to continue their quiet routines. In the top few millimeters of this damp world, sunlight slowly drains away, and a community of microscopic residents, the microphytobenthos, settles into the rhythm of evening. Diatoms, those tiny glass-walled drifters that also choose to live on surfaces, lie in gleaming films like fine, soft paint spread across the mud. Each cell is a perfectly measured chamber of silica, gathered from dissolved minerals, arranged in patterns that would look like lace under a lens. They have spent the day sipping light, building sugars, exhaling traces of oxygen that bubbled up in shy strings, so small they caught and slid along the sand grains like pearls. Now with dusk, the light is low, and their metabolism becomes a lullaby, slower and slower, calm as drift. Kneeling down, or imagining yourself kneeling down, you would see the mud surface more clearly. It is not uniform. There are gentle gleams where thin films pull tight between grains, and tiny pits where a bubble lifted and then popped without sound. You could see fine threads where a worm has fed and moved, passing sediment through a narrow gut that sorts the edible from the knot, returning clean spirals of sand that sit like coils of miniature rope. Each coil is a sign of patience. The flat is full of these small, patient acts, each one a tally mark in the long arithmetic of tides. At your feet, there is a quiet piece of math you can imagine and still feel relaxed, as simple as counting to 4, and then to 4 again, as a day and a night, and then another day and night, and within them a high tide and a low tide, and a high tide and a low tide again. For many coasts, this semi-diurnal pattern is the gentle metronome of the shore, a slow oscillation that moves the edge of the sea back and forth. Every 6 hours or so the water comes and goes, smoothing and shaping, delivering a mixture of salt and fine particles, an organic drift. Every 2 weeks, when the sun and moon align or oppose, the range grows larger, and then it grows smaller again. Spring and neap, a fortnight's breath, a cycle within a cycle. You can think of it as a soft layering of rhythms, the daily rise and fall, the bi-weekly swelling and settling, the monthly lean of the moon closer or farther, the annual tilt of the planet, and the longer, subtler cycles that ride beneath, like harmonics beneath a note. The mud remembers all of it. A thin skin on the surface is the diary of a single day. Beneath, the pages accumulate, laid down in thin sheets and flocculated clumps. Flocculation is one of the clusters when they meet a little salt. Imagine them drifting in a river plume, then reaching the estuary, where a pinch of salinity helps them hold hands. The cluster grows just heavy enough to settle in slow spirals, like a snowflake falling through a perfect windless night. When it lands on the tidal flat, it becomes part of the story, written at low speed, a sheet of fine grains, a thin memory of passing water. Even walking here is a slow conversation with that series of memories. Your footsteps press into the newest layer. A ripple of breeze folds a little water into your prints, leaving a shallow mirror that shows the first stars. Somewhere off to the side, channels snake out toward the sea. The edges fall away in gentle slopes, touched by the scrawl of tiny streams that flow for an hour or two and then pause. And these streams have a lovely habit. When the tide falls, they etch, and when it rises, they soften, and over many cycles, their paths wander in miniature migrations that barely register unless you return often. Think of them as the handwriting of gravity, scribbled and then smoothed. The patient arithmetic of tides leaves such handwriting everywhere, in rills and crests, in low ridges shaped by short wind-blown waves, in pebbles sorted by size, where the water lingered a little longer, in tiny shells edged together in lines that mark where the last tide took its ease. Breathing in, slowly, you notice the quiet, earthy fragrance of an evening shore. It is not sharp, not overwhelming. It is a soft tapestry of scents, a hint of iodine-like seaweed, a round sweetness from organic matter settling into the mud, a mineral clarity like a clean rock after rain. This fragrance comes, in part, from microscopic chemists living in layers beneath your soles. Oxygen, delivered from above during the day and carried into the sediment by burrowing animals and faint diffusion, fades with depth in a gradient so gentle you could imagine it as a color wash, fading from pale to deeper hues. In the topmost film, oxygen lingers, and bacteria that love its presence quietly process the leftovers of the day. Slightly deeper, where oxygen is scarce, other microbes take over, using sulfate or nitrate or iron compounds as the quiet engines for their metabolism. None of this makes any noise. There are no sparks, no flashes, just slow molecular trafficking, electrons moving down calm pathways, energy found and used and released in soft heat, barely more than the background warmth of the earth. If you could pass your hand through the mud without disturbing it, you might feel textures change. The top, smooth and slippery with microbial film, a layer of slightly coarser grains below, with a whisper of firmness, as if the sediment were nodding to your touch. These layers are not sharp boundaries. They ease into one another, the way twilight eases into night. And within them, tiny burrows and tubes carry water to and fro. A small worm draws oxygen down with a flick of cilia. A shrimp pushes it farther with a flick of a tail. In the micro-world, even a gentle movement is enough to tenderly stir chemistry. This is how the flat breathes, not with lungs, but with the movement of its inhabitants and the inevitable patient seepage of water through ripples in the sand hold a texture like fabric. If you look closely at a shallow depression filled with water, you might see a soft pattern of currents at play. A faint breeze crosses, and the surface shivers in delicate lines that travel and then disappear. A small snail lifts its smooth shell and glides with stoic speed toward a bit of diatom film. Its movement draws a curling line behind it, a signature in the mud that will remain until the next tide folds a fresh page over the scene. The snail is one small part of a larger conversation. It grazes, and by doing so, it trims the microbial lawn, keeping it fresh and lively, stimulating growth with the kind of steady attentiveness that a gardener would recognize, but done slowly, day by day, almost imperceptibly. Out over the flat, you notice the hush of birds in the distance. Their silhouettes pass against the deepening sky, not in a rush, but in soft arcs of travel. Waders such as sandpipers and plovers sometimes dot these landscapes, moving like shifting punctuation across the surface. Their refined beaks tap along in even rhythms, feeling more than seeing. They follow scent and texture, the slightest changes in firmness traced through sensitive limbs. The scene remains calm. Even the search for food here seems as gentle as sorting smooth stones in a pocket. Back at your feet, a small raised mound marks the home of a lugworm. This resident is a quiet engineer of the flat, drawing water into one end of its burrow, ingesting sediment, and producing a small spiral of clean material at the other end. Over and over the process repeats, not as a burst of activity, but as a consistent, unhurried routine that blends entirely into the pace of the place. In the path of such work, oxygen finds its way deeper than it would by diffusion alone, and released nutrients find their way upward. The result is a cycling of materials that enriches the surface, fosters the diatom film, and supports the slow economy of the flat. You can think of the lugworm spiral as a signature of this economy, a symbol of exchange and balance, neat and small, repeated many times across this wide space. Now, let the idea of tides move gently through your mind with its quiet arithmetic. The moon pulls on the earth, and so does the sun. The earth spins and the oceans respond. The sea's surface is not still. It flexes with multiple motions layered together, like the soft overlapping of different musical notes that make a chord. Some parts of the world see 2 highs and 2 lows each lunar day, each with slightly different heights, while other places see 1 clear high and 1 low. The details depend on the shapes of ocean basins, the depths of channels, the contours of coasts, and even the rotation of the earth, which sends waves of tide to circulate clockwise here and counterclockwise there, around points of almost no tidal height. These are amphidromic points, quiet centers in the choreography, and away from them the range grows like gentle ripples in a pond. You do not need to hold all the names, just remember the feeling, complex and yet steady, a layered rhythm that repeats. Along the flat, this layered rhythm is translated into the daily act of exposure and submergence. At high water, the sea stretches over the mud like a smooth sheet, sometimes calm as glass, sometimes wrinkled with small waves. surface is revealed again. In spring tides, when the moon is full or new, the sea reaches farther up the shore and then retreats farther down. In neap tides, at the quarter phases, the movement is less dramatic, the water taking shorter steps. Over months, when the moon's orbit brings it a little closer or a little farther, the peaks and dips shift a fingertip more. All of it together creates a schedule that the life here knows intimately without ever checking a clock. The arithmetic is done in muscle memory and in chemical feedback loops, in the way a diatom glides when the light comes, in how a crab times its foraging to the safety of shallow water or the relative quiet of low-tide evening. You continue slowly across the flat, and the light fades toward that blue-grey moment that photographers sometimes call the blue hour. The colours are more subtle now, tones rather than hues, and reflections grow clearer. The mud, which earlier appeared pale beige or soft brown, now looks like polished slate. The pools brighten as the sky grows darker, a quiet paradox the tide knows well. When you pause, you hear more details. Small ticking clicks from shrimp hidden under the surface sound like tiny metronomes. A gentle rustle of a breeze combs the reeds at the edge of the marsh. Somewhere, water slides off a low bank with a silky note, a sound like brushing your hand over woven cloth. Imagine yourself looking closer at the surface and seeing the faintest sheen, a sign of a biofilm. A biofilm is a cooperative layer, a community of bacteria, algae, and other minute organisms woven together in a matrix they build themselves. It holds moisture, binds sediment grains, and changes the texture of the surface just enough to influence the path of a drop of water, the grip of a snail's foot, the reflection of the sky. In the presence of light, the microalgae within it make oxygen, and at dusk they gently slow that work. The transition is gradual, a soft decrescendo, like a dimmer switch sliding down, and in response, the layers below shift their metabolism, each group of microbes turning to the process they do best. Nitrifiers, which use ammonia and oxygen to achieve their serene chemistry, quiet down. Denitrifiers, which ease nitrate back to nitrogen gas in the absence of oxygen, become more comfortable deeper down. Sulfate reducers take their place in the sequence, using sulfate in the lack of oxygen, and above them, chemolithotrophic bacteria patiently oxidize what rises from below. This is not a battle, not a competition to raise your pulse, but a cooperative layering of functions, each doing its part at the pace set by the environment. In some places, these films become thick mats, holding together grains into soft, marshmallow-like sheets. Under them, anoxic pockets form, where oxygen has been entirely consumed and different chemical dances take place. If you were to carefully lift a corner to the surface, well practiced and controlled by the pace of diffusion and the thinness of films. The flat, with its vast surface and thin active layer, keeps everything within bounds. It is a long-developed truce of chemistry. Elsewhere, perhaps nearer the marsh edge, clusters of small mussels nestle together, their shells subtly dark against the mud, their exhaled water a soft jet that barely shows. By anchoring, they create tiny roughness on the surface that baffles currents and leads to small eddies where fine grains can settle. In this way, animals act as landscape makers, giving the mud new ways to hold itself. Their lives here are measured in small, repeated movements and the quiet conditions those create. Over seasons, these clusters grow and shrink, sometimes inviting colonization by little algae that thread between the shells, sometimes sheltering the delicate feet of young grasses. You may find the first blades of eelgrass at the edge of the flat where it meets the gentle subtidal zone. If the water is clear enough at high tide, light greens wave like the slow sway of a field in a breeze. Eelgrass meadows can calm the water's energy, reduce the resuspension of fine particles, and offer a nursery for small fish and invertebrates. Even the blades themselves carry films, micro-communities that lightly paint their surfaces. When the tide recedes, the ends may lie upon the mud like ribbon. When it returns, they lift again, as reliable as a breath. Everything here is tuned to that breath, each organism using a portion of it, each cycle meshing with another. Out beyond the flat, the larger ocean is doing its own arithmetic, sending long waves that feel the bottom as they approach shore, changing shape according to depth and bottom roughness, refracting around points and diffracting past openings. For the flat, these waves often arrive trimmed of energy, their heights gentled by distance and shallow slopes. The wind, moving over open water, pushes small capillary ripples and larger gravity waves in elegant patterns. But in the sheltered low energy of tidal flats, especially on calm evenings like this imagined one, the sea's surface is mostly a polished plate, and the most dynamic motions are the turning of tides. Inlets, deltas, and channels become the calculus of exchange, where the water deepens and the flow tightens. Yet even there, the long-term shape is built incrementally, grain by grain. The sediment that composes this flat came from multiple places. Some started as bits of mountains ground by frost and river, some as tiny shells built by organisms that once drifted or crawled, some as dust blown over oceans and delivered by rain. Each particle's path time averages into the calm at your feet. Grain size tells a story of energy, coarser where water has more strength to carry and drop weight, finer where water lingers and only the smallest can settle. Mud is the product of long patience. Clay and silt accumulate where the energy is just low enough to let them pause. In estuaries, where fresh river meets saline sea, the meeting encourages the smallest particles to unite and settle, creating those flocks that arrive like sleepy snow and lie down in sheets. Over many such arrivals, the flat grows a little thicker. As you let your mind wander, imagine Imagine the mathematical whisper of Stokesian settling without doing any arithmetic aloud. A sphere, tiny and smooth, falling through still water with a speed that is proportional to the square of its size and the difference in density. The idea already suggests an answer you can feel rather than compute. Tiny grains fall very slowly. A larger grain falls a bit faster, and everything is slowed by viscosity almost like a gentle hand. In the real flat, the water is rarely still, and the shapes are irregular, but the essence remains. It is a place of slow arrivals, soft landings, and waiting. The evening deepens, and the first, faint, delicate lights appear above the western horizon as stars greet the night, one by one, like emerging punctuation in an unwritten paragraph. If the moon is present, it participates directly in the event it orchestrates, lifting with quiet dignity. If it is not, its absence is felt only in a subtler tide, a gentler range. In either case, the sky's palette is now more muted, and a velvet hush settles over the flat. At this hour, you might feel a pleasant chill, the kind that suggests a warm drink, but not a rush, the kind that invites a deeper breath and an exhale that seems to blend into the sea's own long exhale. Imagine yourself close to a shallow runnel that snakes through the mud like a silver ribbon. Inside, the water is so clear you can see the grains in the bed. A ripple marks where it accelerates slightly around a gentle bend. In that small acceleration, fine particles lift, drift a short distance, and then sink again as soon as the flow eases. The runnel evolves by these tiny acts, smoothing its inside bend and cutting a little more on the outside, the way a river does on a larger scale. If the tide is rising, you might see the leading edge of the water creep in, thin and graceful, fingers of flow reoccupying old channels, returning not as a rush, but as a slow, inevitable reclamation. If it is falling, the last water lingers in the deeper hollows, and then withdraws in a series of gentle steps. The arithmetic of the tide, as coastal scientists sometimes approach it, involves breaking the motion into simple sinusoids, each with its own period and amplitude, named after the cycles that create them, the principal lunar and solar cycles, and their combinations. Even spoken softly, these names have a rhythm. M2 for the principal lunar semi-diurnal component, S2 for the solar counterpart, K1 and O1 for the principal diurnal constituents. You do not have to hold any numbers, not now. It is enough to know that these components add together, and that by adding, they make the tide we experience. Their sum describes the daily shape of high and low water, whether it will arrive earlier or later tomorrow, whether it will reach the rack line or stop short. This arithmetic is ancient and ongoing, and you can trust it the way you trust your own breathing in sleep. Smooth, slow, regular, with just enough variation to be alive. Erosion and deposition are the two quiet hands shaping this flat. A small wave removes a tiny amount material arrives, sometimes retreating landward as sea levels rise and storms rearrange things. But tonight, these changes are paused at a perceptible scale. All movement is slow enough to be soothing, a flow you can almost measure with your breathing. You inhale. Somewhere a sand grain skitters and then stops. You exhale. A bubble emerges from a burrow and breaks soundlessly at the surface. Under the dimming light, the microbial world continues its work. Along oxygen gradients only a couple of millimeters deep, communities organize themselves elegantly. You can imagine a vertical rain of electrons moving from the products of photosynthesis and organic decay downward through a chain of processes. Each step is a small release of energy, used by organisms that occupy a particular depth. The surface sees oxygen-rich conditions in the day and a gentle depletion at night. Below, iron and manganese may shift between oxidized and reduced forms, coloring the sediment differently just beneath the skin. Some of those colors, faint shades of grey, brown, and even deep blue-black, are hidden by a mere pinch of sediment and revealed if a tiny burrow opens a window. The flat is full of such hidden art, revealed to those who look with care, and then buried again under the next layer of block and film. In this hush, you can think of the flat as a filter. Water passes over, and as it does, it exchanges substances with the sediment. Nutrients like nitrate, phosphate, and ammonium move according to their gradients. Weak and patient, organic material settles and is processed, not in a sudden burn, but in a slow, sustained hum. The result is a regulation of the coastal sea around it, a smoothing out of concentrations, and a tidying of detritus. Even the mud's sticky surface plays a role, holding on to certain molecules, releasing them again when conditions change, binding fine particles and keeping them from being swept away. The flat's broadness, its exposure, and its thin, active skin make it a superb, quiet machine for taking in the day's offerings and returning them in measured amounts. Nearby, a crab moves just beneath the surface, the subsidence of the mud revealing a faint path that closes behind it like the trail of a finger through flour. It pauses, waits, and then continues, each movement deliberate. Near a burrow entrance, a hermit crab's borrowed shell sits like a small, elegant ornament half tucked into the mud, its resident withdrawing slowly as you pass, then resuming its relaxed exploration as your presence fades. There is no urgency here. The timing is set by the tide, and the tide is generous. It arrives, it departs, it returns. Even the creatures that must shelter from exposure know they will be covered again. The flat supports that trust. Imagine lifting your gaze toward the horizon. Out there, the meeting line of water and sky is tender, almost invisible now, blurred by the soft darkness. If you listen, you might hear the open sea, low and steady, like a cat purring behind a door. In the near field, the flat itself is silent, and in that silence, your attention turns inward, then outward again, gently, like a buoy rising and falling. Each time you attend to the scene, you find the same calm recognize the thin shining threads where water draws itself tightly, the faint glint of mica flakes in the mud, the soft edge where a pool meets a ridge, curved and smooth as a pebble. On the scale of seasons, these flats change colors and textures. In the warmth of summer, biofilms may grow thick, and the surface sometimes shows slightly cracked skin where hot midday sun dries a patch between tides. In winter, the films grow thinner, the water is clearer, and the chill promotes a firmer feeling underfoot. But dusk always brings a similar hush. The glow at the western edge of the day always slides toward the same quiet, and the arithmetic is always there, adding up the sun and moon, assembling the next arrival and departure. Now imagine tracking a single tide, one rise and one fall, from start to finish. Before the rising tide, at the lowest low, the flat is most exposed, and the outer edge shows ridges trimmed by the previous ebb. High in the intertidal, strands of dried seaweed mark a line where the last spring tide reached. As the water begins to return, it arrives first in narrow pathways, filling existing channels and seepage lines. The leading edge is not sharp. It seeps and advances in fingers that coalesce. The first thin films are clean, reflecting the sky without distortion. They thicken to shallow sheets. Isolated pools become connected. Islands of mud shrink, then dissolve into peninsulas, and finally vanish under an even cover. For a time, the whole flat is a vast, ankle-deep sea that glistens and moves without breaking, offering to the wind the largest possible canvas for making minute waves. At this stage, the broadcast of the sky across the water is spectacular in a quiet way. Gradients of colour slide across the surface, broken only by the patterning of ripples and by the ombre of your own figure if you were there in person. As the tide reaches its high water, those minute waves thin and slacken, the current slow in channels. Everything seems to hold its breath. At slack high, life that waits to forage under cover takes its moment. When the tide turns, the sheet of water glides seaward, gently accelerating at first, then following the slope of the flat. Currents gather in channels, and these channels do the most work of moving sediment. But even here, at dusk, in your mind's quiet visit, it is all an unhurried procession. The ebb reveals, a little at a time, the textures laid down earlier. The edge of retreat is a long, even line that snakes and then straightens, its path set by the intricacies of the landscape and the subtle push of wind. Low points glisten the longest. High ridges dry first, and with that drying, a faint temporary crust can form where salt crystals draw a tiny lattice at the surface, only to be dissolved again when the water returns. The cycle closes and opens and closes again with infinite patience. Over the years, humans have watched these flats and learned to read them. In some places, the line of poles marks channels for small boats that slip in and out with the rising tide, a practice as old as coastal communities. In other regions, low fences installed to catch drifting sediment, or brushwood arrays that break small waves, help the flat grow a little faster, encouraging nature nature's own slow construction. Harvesters of shellfish kneel and stand in rhythms as old as the tide itself, moving with quiet purpose, pausing between lifts, checking and returning. In winter, people walk along the edges under pale skies, the breath from their mouths mixing with sea fog. In summer, children and adults wander barefoot and then learn, gently, to watch where they step, to notice the seams and soft places, to respect the hidden burrows. The human presence is part of the long story here, ideally respectful, ideally attuned to the slow pace of the place. If you imagine the microscopic scale again, you can think of Brownian motion, the constant random jostling of tiny particles, as something like the sea's smallest murmurs. In a droplet resting on the mud, minute bits drift and bump. Over time, diffusion, powered by these small movements, moves molecules along invisible gradients. This is how oxygen reaches a particular niche. This is how small signals carry. It is all very gentle. The drop does not churn. It breathes. On the level of a cell, membranes allow passage to some molecules and discourage others, building delicate gradients maintained by pumps that work without fanfare, day and night. At dusk, these processes continue in the soft dark the way a watch's hands continue under your pillow. Looking around, you might notice the subtle boundary between the flat and the grassy marsh. It is not a wall, but an overlap marked by slightly firmer ground, by the presence of plants whose roots stitch the sediment together. Spartina or other salt-tolerant grasses lean, holding beads of water at the tips of their blades. The marsh exudes a sweeter, more herbal note to the air. It damps waves and curates sediment deposition. In return, the flat offers nutrients and the space for grasses to slowly reach seaward over years. At the toe of this marsh, mud snails gather, tracing loops and arcs that collect into patterns like penmanship. The roots below house their own communities, including bacteria that can handle both oxygenated water at low tide and saturated soils at high tide. Here, the transition between terrestrial and marine is not a line, but a gradient, as smooth as the sky to the horizon. As your attention flows from detail to detail, you may sense that the body is relaxing. The shoulders settle a little, the jaw loosens, the breath reduces in volume, the eyes soften. The scene supports that. The colors around you are cool and gentle. The textures are free of sharp edges. Every sound is the kind you could fall asleep to. Repetitive, soft, regular. The small slaps of wavelets on distant stones are like heartbeats. The faint hiss where the breeze touches reeds could be a soft white noise. Even the occasional bird call arrives spare and solitary, then dissolves. In the distance, an eel-like pattern of meandering raised bars crosses a shallow area, relict tidal ridges that have migrated a little since last season. Their spacing reflects the balance of currents and sediment supply. Stand still for a moment, and you can almost sense how, over many tides, they have inched along, each crest stepping in the direction of the dominant flow, so slowly across surfaces that you would need to speed up time to see it. Across a day, a diatom community migrates up and down the top fraction of a millimeter, following light and chemistry. In the morning, they rise to greet the sun. At midday, they ease downward to avoid intense illumination. In evening, they return to the very top to take advantage of the remaining light and the improved conditions when the air cools. They do this with molecular motors and secreted polysaccharide tracks, like infinitesimal railways laid down and lifted again. This movement makes the surface sticky, encouraging more sediment to settle and stay. It is likely that your footprints subtly rearrange these careful distributions, but the film heals itself swiftly, smoothing your passing with long practice. You can imagine holding a small glass vial, scooping up a bit of water from a shallow pool at the edge of the flat. If you could observe it under a microscope later, you would see more life. The delicate sweep of cilia on a protozoan, the star-shaped chloroplasts of green algae, the almost geometrical profiles of other diatoms. Everything would move slowly, predictably, like a clockwork whose hands are far apart, yet never stop. The proteins that power these movements cycle with energy from tiny molecules, the ATP generated from sugar or from gradients built across membranes. All of this proceeds at a pace that respects the landscape we are in. Simple, steady, unhurried. The horizon darkens. The sky, now with more stars, offers a gentle lesson in scattering. If there are clouds, they may be higher cirrus that blush a soft coral and then fade to grey-blue. The reason, in quiet terms, is that shorter wavelengths of sunlight scatter more strongly in the atmosphere, leaving longer wavelengths to paint the late sky. And then, as the sun sinks further, even those drop away, and we're left with the deepening blue of the high vault. No need to unpack the equations. Feel instead how the light stroked the world as it left, and how the flat accepted that touch and let it go. Across the flats, the geometry of water and mud intersects with the geometry of sound. Soft sounds travel farther here, with few obstacles to scatter or absorb them. The light lap of the tide can be heard at a distance. If you bend and listen to the mud itself, you might catch the faint crackle produced by snapping shrimp, or the tiny fizz of microbubbles rising from photosynthesis brought to the surface by burrowers, especially earlier in the afternoon. It is an almost imperceptible symphony. Together, these sounds are like a low, steady rustle, a fabric of acoustics that holds the space. During particularly low tides, when the water is far away due to spring range and perhaps a modest offshore wind, the flat can feel vast. In those moments, its slight slope becomes apparent. A few centimeters of elevation difference there means a long reach of exposure here. You can understand how the topography shapes ecology. Higher areas dry sooner and more often, favoring organisms that tolerate drying. Lower areas are submerged longer, favoring others. The frequency and duration of exposure is a clock that species read. Some microalgae are early risers, preferring thin films of water. Some are late sleepers, waiting until the robust cover of high tide. Creatures with shells tuck in, holding moisture. Worms retreat along their burrows, yourself moving less, standing longer between steps, letting the evening wrap around you. A light jacket would feel right. The cool air on your fingertips is a gentle tingle. You might rub your hands together once, slowly, the sound barely audible, the warmth a small comfort. The horizon is now a black line. Overhead the stars are more numerous, and to the east the moon, if present, may have lofted to a low, serene height. The tide continues its scheduled journey, and in this moment you can imagine that the arithmetic that governs it is the most tranquil sort, the addition and subtraction of small, perfectly weighted terms, the multiplication by calm constants, the division by long periods. The sum is a wave that moves under you, not taking you anywhere quickly, but keeping time for everything you see. Still awake, comment the secret word, nebula. At the scale of a coastline, tidal flats can form broad, gentle shelves that protect shorelines by dissipating wave energy. The vast shallow depth means that waves feel the bottom early and lose energy to friction and to the generation of small ripples. The flats perform this service without complaint, day after day, acting as quiet buffers. In return, they ask for time, for calm sediment supply, for the absence of sudden disruption. Where they meet salt marshes and mangroves, they become partners in coastal stability. The mud building up as roots and stems baffle flow, the vegetation reaching seaward as the base rises. This drawing down of energy creates habitats for many species. Fish from the sea using shallow waters as nurseries, birds crossing continents stopping to feed, invertebrates conducting their entire lives within a few meters of one another. Yet nothing about this assembly needs to be hectic. The life of the flat is patient. Consider gently the role of tides in connecting these habitats to the larger sea. When the tide ebbs, it carries with it a thin stream of organic matter, tiny particles and dissolved products of decay and photosynthesis, out into the estuary and then the ocean. When it floods, it brings fresh oxygen and new larvae, the seeds of future communities. The flat is the table where these exchanges are set out, a broad surface on which the daily meal is served and cleared in a long, unfussy routine. This is one of the simplest ways a coastline lives, by breathing in and out with the tide. If you imagine a scientific instrument placed here, it would be a humble probe gathering data in a way that echoes the mood of the place. Slowly, steadily, tick by tick, a tide gauge records the rise and fall with millimeter precision. A current meter rotates almost imperceptibly as water passes. A dissolved oxygen sensor notes a gentle sawtooth shape in its record across days, higher during sunlit exposure, lower at night and underwater, each cycle like the gentle up and down of your chest as you prepare for sleep. A sediment trap collects falling particles, and over weeks an accumulation is measured, telling a story of the season's productivity and the river's deliveries. Taken together, these devices translate the flat's calm processes layers reflecting the history of oxygen conditions and iron states. Under magnification, these layers resolve into seasons and events. A thin sandy stripe might indicate a storm that reached in and spread a blanket over the mud. A dark band could be a period of higher organic accumulation. Pollen grains from terrestrial plants might record nearby forests and fields of long ago. Even in this tranquil story, you can read changes not as alarms, but as variations in a long melody. As the night becomes fuller, you notice the people who built their lives close to such flats have often used the tide's arithmetic to their advantage. They gathered salt in evaporative pans warmed by the sun. They farmed the sea in shallow enclosures that fill and drain naturally. They laid out paths for foot and cart between islands timed to low tide, and knew to watch the moon and the winds before setting out. A simple stick pushed into the mud near the water's edge will tell the tide's story. The waterline climbs or falls against it at a few centimeters per minute. Mark by mark, a humble gauge. The way they used the tide was slow, patient, tuned to recurrence, respectful of the hazards, mindful of the benefits. That is the way of the flat, unhurried, dependable, generous. In the shallow water at the edge, there is an effect you may have seen. As a wave approaches, it stretches and then feels the gradient of depth. The crest slows gently. The back catches up. The wave steepens and sometimes breaks as a small, spilling crest that whispers more than it shouts. The foam that forms, especially if there is surfactant from natural organic matter in the water, clings and then slides, drawing arcs of white that dissolve into the skin of the water. The foam can reveal otherwise invisible eddies, the soft swirls where flow bends around a protrusion or over a slight hump. Watching foam is a peaceful pastime. It is like watching the wind trace itself on wheat, or the way smoke paints the air's pattern. On nights with a clear sky and little wind, you might find the edges of pools rimmed with a thin ice in the cold season, the ice patterns telling their own tale. Ice grows from the edges inward, making large crystals that catch starlight in a quiet glitter. Under the ice, life slows further, but continues. The flat tolerates these changes with ease, adjusting the pace of chemistry, waiting a little longer between tides for warming, trading speed for stability. When the season turns back to warmth, the biofilm thickens again. The diatoms rise earlier in the day. The smell of the flat gains a hint of sweetness with the increased decomposition of fresh organic matter. Each turning is part of the map of the year, and at dusk every day is the same gentle hour, no matter the month. If you imagine setting up a small lantern on the shore and placing yourself a little way away from it, you might see how its glow reflects on the wet mud in long, thin lines, stretching and then bending with the subtle unevenness of the surface. Each small ridge in the mud interrupts the reflection, causing a slight flicker as a ripple of water passes. The mud becomes a mirror and a mosaic at once. You could watch it for a long time and notice your mind slowing to the same pace, thoughts arriving, being noticed, and then slipping away like the reflection in a pool that shivers and then stills. shallow water paints a temporary comet tail that fades back into black. A small fish makes a dashed line. In such nights, the arithmetic of the tide includes a term from tiny living lamps. The chemistry behind bioluminescence, involving luciferin and luciferase, is again a gentle process, a substrate, an enzyme, a photon released as the reaction takes place. The light is not hot, it is transient, a brief sigh of energy, a defense against being seen or approached. On flats where this happens, the water can feel alive in a visible way, and even then the feel is of wonder rather than stimulation, an invitation to stand still and watch the night draw paths in the shallows. A little farther inland, away from the immediate edge, there may be pools that do not empty completely with every tide. These pools become temporary laboratories for evaporation and concentration. In warm weather, they may become slightly saltier, and their floors may show delicate crystals. In cooler seasons, they keep a bit of water when the surrounding mud dries, offering a refuge to small creatures until the next tide reconnects everything. The pools tolerate change. Their edges are often fringed by rings of colour as different algae and bacteria find their preferred salinity. If you were to pass your finger along such an edge, you would feel a slickness, a clue to the biofilm at work, a soft reminder that even stationary water is teeming with quiet activity. On the subject of relationships, think about how the organisms here engage with one another in ways that echo the ebb and flow. The microbial community produces substances that many small grazers rely upon. The grazers, by gently disturbing the surface, prevent the film from becoming too thick or too dominated by a single species, maintaining diversity. The burrowers, by mixing oxygen and deepening the rhythm of oxygen delivery, prevent the build-up of unfavorable conditions, making the flat livable for many. Birds disturb the surface and stimulate movement. Tides redistribute larvae and spores, mixing the gene pool. The system participates in its own maintenance, not as a conscious choice, but as a consequence of millions of small, patient interactions. The net result is steady resilience, the kind you can sense when you stand, listening and watching, and feel that everything is in place. In your own body, right now, a similar interplay is taking place. Your breath moves in and out, bringing oxygen in, letting carbon dioxide return to the air. Your heart beats in slow cadence. Your nervous system guides you into deeper relaxation, encouraging the release of muscle tension, slowing the mind's urgent loops, replacing them with longer, slower waves. Your perception drifts, and the image of the flat becomes a place your thoughts can stroll without effort. The mud's neutral tones keep your imagination soothed. The repetitiveness of ripples gives your mind an easy pattern to rest upon. The idea of arithmetic here is one of balance and simplicity, not of heavy computation. Add a little and subtract a little in gentle cycles, forever. Out to sea, the tide wave continues around basins, deflected the range grows, and other places where it shrinks. The pattern is complex but comprehensible, like the overlapping rings made when two pebbles are dropped into a pond at different times, not chaotic, just layered. In narrow inlets, the range may be amplified by the funneling effect. On very broad continental shelves, the range may be dampened or shifted in time. Each coastline is a unique instrument on which the tide plays its long piece. Tonight, on your flat, the instrument is a low, soft drum, played with brushes, steady and kind. You may find pleasure in the thought that many coastal cultures across the world have given names to these tides and their nuances, naming the smallest variations, the ones that make this flat accessible earlier or later by a few minutes, that allow a boat to cross a bar, that reveal a patch of clams for a little longer. Language holds these details lovingly, and through language, knowledge is shared. A parent teaches a child to read the sky, to note the line of foam, to feel the firmness underfoot, to smell the approach of the sea. The knowledge accumulates in families the way sediment accumulates on the flat, in thin, steady layers. The world around you in this view is evolving very slowly. Sea level, on long time scales, rises and falls with climate. The land subsides or uplifts. Sediment supply changes with river flows, land use, storms, and human interventions. These are long stories, and tonight is a single stanza. The flat is not permanent in the strict sense, but it is stable enough for the moment you need for rest. It has existed long enough to become a reliable friend to your imagination. You can walk across it in remembrance and in future plans. When you return, if only in mind, you will find the same calm details waiting, because they are not attached to an exact arrangement so much as to a way of being. The flat is the embodiment of patience. In the near dark, if you tilt your head just so, the faint sheen of water on the mud reflects the band of the Milky Way when the sky is clear enough. A dusty swath turned into a gentle smear across the grounded mirror. The union of mud and stars is one of the quiet joys of tidal flats at night. It is a reminder that while your feet are on soft ground, your thoughts can float on the horizon of the universe and then return to the wet scent at your ankles, to the soft tick of shrimp, to the whisper of breeze. As the tide reaches its low point once more, the exposed area is largest, and the flat settles into its deepest quiet. The cooling air carries the scent of salt a bit more strongly. The firm parts of the surface are cool to the touch. If you walk, your steps produce small sounds. A soft squelch here, a faint crunch where a shell fragment lies. You can choose to stop, to find a place to stand or sit, perhaps bringing your knees to your chest, arms around them, rocking mildly with the rhythm of your breath, eyes half closed. The world is simply a large, open, darkened room, and the sound system is set to the gentlest ambient track. Imagine the gentle concept of carrying capacity without urgency. The flat, with its area, its frequency of inundation, resources are left. Over time, densities fluctuate around long-term averages that reflect everything that is available. The flat is never empty, nor is it overrun. It is simply itself, adapting, adjusting, gently. The numbers are not important. The trend is. It is a trend toward balanced occupation, the way a room full of sleepers settles into a similar rate of breath and then holds it for hours. Driftwood sometimes appears on flats as the tide deposits it. It arrives wet and heavy, its grain swollen, the bark sometimes softened by long travel. It becomes a small island around which sediment is restructured, a place for barnacles to settle if the water lingers, a perch for a bird at low water. For a time, it adds texture to the flat, then the next tide may take it away. The story of driftwood is like the story of a passing thought. It arrives, it sits, it gathers associations, and then it leaves, and the surface is smooth again. In terms of temperature, the mud can be slightly warmer than the air at night due to the day's heat holding, or it can be cooler if the day was cold and the night is clear. The thin boundary layer above the mud affects this exchange, a shallow region where the air is slowed and its properties influenced by the surface. This layer is often gently stratified, with cooler, slightly denser air near the mud. Movement of the wind stirs it, but on nights like this one in the imagination, the stirring is minimal. As a result, the temperatures feel consistent, and the scent and moisture in the air feel constant too, a stable field that helps make the night restful. Gazing back toward the land, you might see the soft geometry of dunes or the linear stitch of a seawall, perhaps the dark outline of trees, a distant light from a house or a lighthouse or a small village glows amber and still. Sometimes a car passes on a road far beyond the marsh, the sound a gentle wash that hardly reaches you. The flat insulates you from these things by simple distance and by the low acoustic reflectivity of its broad surface. In the near field, the world is as quiet as a library at closing time. You might think of the change in pressure under the thin sheet of water as the tide moves. The weight of the water varies by a meter or two, perhaps more in some places, perhaps less in others, depending on the geography. The earth yields a little under this load, an almost elastic response that is too small to feel, too slow to notice, but real. The continents and sea floors flex and relax slightly, and the solid earth tide, like the ocean tide, follows the pull of gravitational forces. Imagine the planet's crust breathing with the same frequency as the sea on its surface, in and out, a fraction of a millimeter here, a few in some places, everywhere another gentle rhythm. This image can be comforting, as if the whole planet were participating in the same slow pattern, and you are merely sinking to it. If you have ever pressed your palm into wet sand and watched water fill the print from below, you have seen capillary rise, the gentle tug of water climbing through the finest spaces between grains. On flats, this process helps keep the surface moist a little longer after the tide recedes, providing the film the conditions it likes. In fine sediments, water, which we think of as seeking the lowest place, will also happily move upward a little where the spaces are small and the forces delicate. Some evenings a light fog arrives, sliding in from the water in low layers, not thick, but enough to blur the world into a watercolored painting. The fog beads on hair and eyebrows and on the tips of grass blades, adding weight to every small thing. Sounds become more diffuse. The glow from distant lights spreads and softens. Fog loves flats because the temperature difference between water and air is minimal, and the wide surface offers a constant reservoir for moisture. It does not surprise the flat. The mud accepts it and holds it like a new sheet laid over the old, thin and almost transparent. A good night to rest is one where repetition and softness dominate. The repeated lines of ripples, the repeated curves of runnels, the repeated calls of distant birds, the repeated arrival and departure of little waves. Even the repeated mention of repetition begins to rock your thoughts. You might imagine that with each repetition, your awareness drifts a few millimeters deeper into quiet, the way a worm's burrow extends a little farther with each gentle push. You might begin to blur the edges between the scene and the voice guiding you until you are simply in the presence of the shore, breathing with it. Under the surface of shallow pools around your ankles or in your imagination, you might watch the dance of surface tension, that invisible skin that allows a water strider to use the pool as a stage. Its legs dimple the surface without breaking it, spreading neat troughs that reflect the sky differently from the surrounding water. A falling leaf that touches the pool can float because the same skin holds it. The balance between gravity and surface tension at this scale is tilted toward the latter, and small things behave differently as a result. These differences are charming to those who like to notice the details of physics in ordinary sights. To a sleepy mind, they become a soothing pattern to ponder without effort. At the margins of the flat, little pebbles sometimes click together as soft waves draw them and release them. This quiet ticking is perhaps one of the most restful sounds, created by simple forces at the simplest scale. The rocks polish one another through countless small contacts, just as ideas in your mind can be smoothed by being returned to often and held up to different angles of light. If an occasional larger stone lies half buried, it anchors a patch of the landscape, casting a long oval reflection in the thinning light, acting as a reference point for your wandering gaze. Returning to the subject of the tide's arithmetic for a moment, consider the idea of nodal modulation, the subtle change in the amplitude of certain tidal constituents over an 6-year cycle tied to the moon's orbital tilt. Even the tide's parent body, so steady to our senses, provides a gentle variation over years. The variation is not sudden or harsh. It is a background swell in the data, slightly bigger swings in some years, slightly smaller in others, a long, slow breath layered beneath the quick ones. This is the kind of phenomenon that rewards long attention and at the same time allows you to forget it entirely when you don't need it. It is a serene fact, a soft knows what to do. It is perfectly acceptable to sit down now, perhaps on a small dry patch or a folded jacket, and feel the coolness through the fabric, the support of firm mud below, the tiny shifts as you adjust. Perhaps you place your hands palms down beside you and feel the faint grit against your skin. You could trace a slow circle in the mud with a fingertip, then fill it with a spoon of water from a nearby pool, watching as the water smooths the circle's edges, as if ironing. When you grow still, you feel the balance of your body, the simple geometry of bone and muscle settling under gravity, and the comfort of being held by the land. At some late hour, when your senses are tuned to the quietest details, you can catch the sigh of the world in the form of a distant, steady resonance. It is nothing more than the combined hum of water moving in and out of coasts everywhere, a global sleep song. The tidal flats, in huge number, contribute to its volume the way a chorus adds voices. Each flat, like this one, performs the same piece, shifting subtly by latitude and basin, by local geography and season, but always within the same key, always with the same pace. The last part of your attention now can settle on the smallest object you choose. Perhaps it is a tiny shell, ridged, no larger than a fingernail, the remnant home of a very small snail. It has been rolled in the mud and then rinsed by the tide, and in the glow of the dim sky it shines ever so slightly. It represents a single life, now part of the sediment's aggregate. If you hold it up to your ear in imagination, you will hear nothing but your own breath. That is perfect. That is enough for tonight. When you are ready to draw back from this place, do it as calmly as the tide itself. Let your awareness lift like the water at flood, returning to the line of the shore, to the firmness of where you truly rest. Keep the flat as a place you can return to whenever your mind needs a large, soft room. The mud, the microbes, and the patient arithmetic of tides will be here in your memory, holding steady, adding calm each time you revisit, subtracting worry, multiplying comfort, dividing the night into manageable, gentle hours. If your eyes are already closing, let them close. If they are open, let them half close, and let your surroundings lighten in your mind until only the rhythm remains. Thank you for sharing this quiet walk and these quiet thoughts. May the tide's slow breath accompany your own, and may the shore's patient arithmetic help you drift into an easy, restorative sleep. If you found this calming, feel welcome to subscribe and leave a like so we can keep releasing videos this often. And when you need more gentle journeys, the playlist in the description will be there to guide you, one soft step at a time. Rest well.